Hi, this is Robin, and in this video I'm going to be talking about and showing how to work with artistic blur effects in Photoshop. I started experimenting with creating different types of blur because sometimes I just didn't have the lens I wanted with me when I was out shooting, and I wanted to create the perfect soft background blur or bokeh, and I just didn't get the blur that I wanted because of having the wrong lens. Sometimes I just plain goofed and I used the wrong settings, or I wasn't the right distance from my subject to get the kind of separation that would have given me the blur that I wanted. So I've been happy to figure out here that I can fix those things where I wanted blur but didn't get it in Photoshop. You might ask, well, why would I even want blur? Because blur, don't you want everything to be in focus or sharp from front to back? And my answer is no. Blur, I think, adds to the aesthetics of and the ability for our viewers to identify the main subject or subjects or the main point of emotional interest that motivated our photos and photo-based art. So when you have blur contrasted with sharpness in an image, it will help direct viewers' attention to key parts of the photo or the image that you're working with. It holds for art principles as well as for photography. And just, I guess, psychologically or whatever it is that drives it, people are drawn to look at what's sharp in an image, and especially if it's surrounded by blur, just like they're drawn to look at brightness if there's something in the image that is dark. So having the sharpness contrasted with blur is a way to direct viewer attention in your images so you can use it very strategically as well as artistically. The other thing that blur does is it can help either remove or minimize distractions in scenes. So it's not necessarily a good thing to have tons and tons of detail and sharp detail in your images. It's just too much for people to absorb, and then they won't know what the point was you were trying to make with the image if there is too much and their eyes are just flying all around the whole image. So blur can minimize distractions. That's the second point of a benefit of using it. Another thing that blur can be used for is to imply depth to a scene. So it can look awfully flat if everything is all in focus, but if you have perhaps some foreground blur, then a sharp area, and then background blur, it definitely gives somebody a sense of moving into a scene and having some depth to the scene. So you essentially give a 3D aspect to a 2D medium. So that's another way that blur can be used and that I've been experimenting with. And then finally, the last point I'm going to mention, I'm sure there must be others, but these are the main ones that I've been playing around with, is that blur can also emphasize or imply motion or movement. So if you have a little bit of movement already in your image and you want to make things look like they've got even more movement, well, then using blur, you can do that. And if you didn't catch something just the way you wanted to, like let's say you were going out and you were trying a panning shot, which is where you track with a moving object, and it's not the easiest thing to do until you get the hang of it. You might need to take a lot of shots. Well, if you weren't so successful, then you actually can achieve that effect in Photoshop. So it's something to keep, in back of mind. There's something that you can try to correct if you weren't competent enough, like sometimes I haven't been with my camera. So in this video workshop, I'm going to include only one video this time, but I have created 3 demos, or I'm going to create 3 demos on the use of blur using different blur effects. And so what I'll do is create a set of 3 individual videos for you showing those 3 different types of effects. So in this video, I'm going to focus on background blur. So that's more of a soft overall Gaussian bokeh or motion blur or radial blurs. So the radial blurs will be a little bit more of a special effect, both spin and zoom. In another video, I will show how to work with selective focus. So I don't know if you're familiar with Lensbaby lenses, but what they typically give you is a very sharp focus area and a very fast fall off or shallow, soft focused surround. And so to get that Lensbaby-like effect, I will, and with this selective focus, I'll do another video on that type of approach to using blur. And then in the third video in the set that I'm going to produce near term here, I'll do another video on depth of field and how to have a sharp subject and then different tiers of blur in the foreground, midground, and background. So I guess that's, just to kind of lay out what the plan is with this. I always like to let you know that if you have not done so already, please feel free to click the subscribe button below the video. And then what that will do is get you a single notification directly from YouTube when I do post new content once or twice a month. If you've subscribed to another one of my videos, you're all set. You don't need to do anything. So with that in mind, let me move on to the first demo here, and then this is going to be this first whole video, which is working with background blur. And I'm using this image here, which is an Adobe stock image of this gentleman on a skateboard for my example photo. And again, this is a straight photo. This isn't a composite. Besides a portrait such as this, where you have a person and then you want to blur behind them, this kind of effect is also very good for things like blurring the background behind vehicles of various sorts, behind animals. If you're in a more commercial field, perhaps, and you want to do product marketing and you want to highlight your product and then blur out the area behind it, the technique that I'm going to show today in this video would be useful for that kind of thing also. And then finally, right before we get into more of the step-by-step demo, I do like to give you a tour of my Photoshop interface since I have customized it. So we have my layers panel is up here where my highlight circle is. The properties panel is right here at the bottom, and then my toolbar is docked right so that everything is conveniently located. Okay, so now let's get into working with the background blur using this example image. So the first thing I always recommend that we do is once you've opened your image, duplicate that background layer so you're not working on the original. You can either do a Control or Command J, or just click on it and drag it down to the bottom of the layers panel to that add new layer icon right there. Okay, so now we have a duplicate that we can be working on and leave the original one alone. The first step in this process is to select your subject. And I know you're not working with this image, so whatever subject you want to be in focus against a blurred background, that's what you're going to be selecting. In my case, it's this skateboarder dude here. So I'm going to go to my toolbar and come down to that square with the arrow pointing into it, which is the object selection tool, and left click on that to make it active. You can see the black is there, so it's active. If you have an older version of Photoshop and don't have the object selection tool, you can work with the quick selection tool or whatever other selection process you typically like to use in Photoshop. Once that tool is active, come to the top of the interface to the options bar, and we're going to click on select subject. I have mine set, this down arrow will give you two options. I have mine set by default to go out to the cloud and be more accurate. The other alternative is to do the select subject on device, which is faster. So you can experiment and see which works better for you. But I'm going to left click there, and Photoshop is doing its thing. And it has now made a selection of this man. And I'm going to make this bigger so we can see what we're working with here. And you can see the selection is there because you see the marching ants all around him. Now, it has missed some of the elements of the image, so I'll try to just quickly, I'm not going to get too perfectionist about this. I'm going to go to the quick selection tool and try to make some quick, hopefully, modifications to what Photoshop selected. Just get a little bit more of the wheel. I typically work with a stylus because it can be more accurate, but I'm working with a mouse now, so hopefully it won't go too crazy. And take the time that you need with your own image. Since this is for demo purposes, I don't need to have you watch me do every little thing, but like if there's hair in yours and you want to work with select and mask, I do have other videos in my channel about how to make and refine selections. So if you want to look at, some of them, then you can see how to do that. And I'm just adding and subtracting as needed here to try to get this. And I may not get too perfectionisty here, just so that it gets finished. And this missed part of this area here. Usually with Photoshop, once you've gone back and forth a few times, it learns where you want its edges, the edges to be for a selection. And so I think before we have any disasters, I'm going to just leave that there. Okay, so now we have the marching ants on your main subject that you want to have in focus, and I've got that on mine. So now with those marching ants active, you want to duplicate that subject onto its own empty layer. And you can, I'm going to do Control, for you it would be Command. I'm on a Windows machine, so Control or Command J to jump it onto its own layer. And if you look over here in the Layers panel on the right, you can see he is now on his own empty layer. So what I'm going to do is just double click on that word, and I'm going to type skateboarder, so we know what that is when we get into multiple layers. And the reason I am putting, so what we're going to do next is try to eliminate him from this scene and create a clean background plate. So in other words, he will not be in it. It'll all just be background. And then that's why I want him on his own layer, because after we do whatever blurs are needed to this background, then I'm just going to overlay the nice sharp guy right on top of that. And the reason I'm telling you to do that approach versus here, I hear people out there already saying, well, why doesn't she just select him and then blur the area around him? And the reason I do not do that and do not recommend you do that is that when you do that and then add a blur, it's almost like that blur is in motion and it comes and bumps up and bounces off your subject. And I mean, technically it's not doing that, but that's how it looks, because what you end up with is almost like this ridged vignette or halo around the subject when you use that approach. And we don't want that to happen because it doesn't look very natural. It looks very fake. So what we're trying to do is create a situation where the entire background is blurred and then you overlay your subject onto it. So clearly he is there right now. So what we want to do is, first of all, after getting him onto his own empty layer, or your subject onto its own empty layer, is turn off the eye icon for that layer so it's not visible. You're still seeing him because he's in these background images, so that's why he's still there. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is working on this background copy. So click back there again and make sure it's blue and that is highlighted. We want to duplicate or select him again so that we can fill in the space where he is and create a relatively clean background. So the way I'm going to do that is with this background layer highlighted. You'd press Control or Command and then left click on this guy on the empty layer. There we go. And it's reloaded the selection. So for whatever you've put as your subject on that empty layer, if you do a Control or Command and left click on that layer, even while this is highlighted, it will reload the selection. Okay, so now we've got him. So now what we want to do is fill in what's surrounding him into this space. The way to do that is because this is clinging to him, we want to be sure we get some of the surroundings and we don't end up with any of him. So what we want to do is go to the top of the interface. So again, this layer, background copy layer, is active, to where it says select. So go to the select menu, left click on that, come down to where it says modify, and then come out to this flyout menu to where it says expand, and we'll get this little pop-up of expanding the selection. So basically what, in this case, what we're doing, you can also do a minimize, but for this situation, we want to expand. We want to go broader beyond the subject. So I would say use between 3 and 5 pixels. I think for mine, I'm going to use 5. Okay, so expand by 5 pixels. So that means it's going to push out from him out into his surroundings by 5 pixels, and just click OK. Once that is done, now we want to, right click inside your still marching ants selection of your subject. So right click inside there. And I'm going to come down this menu list to where it says Content Aware Fill. If you want, you can experiment and see how well Delete and Fill selection works too. But for something busy like this, I'm going to personally try Content Aware Fill. So you can try either one with your image and see what works best for you. So Content Aware Fill will give you some choices of where it's going to choose what to fill with. Delete and Fill will just do a fill, and then you'll be back in your interface. Okay, so here's the interface for Content Aware Fill. And just as I said, all these pink areas is what Photoshop is looking for as reference to what to fill the space he occupies with. And you can see a preview in here of how it's turning out. It's not too bad, actually. So maybe, I don't know if I need all of this, or if by, I don't know if you can see, in the center of my highlighter here, right where I'm spinning it around, there's a minus sign. So you can paint and remove areas of the overlay that you don't want Photoshop to use for reference in filling the area he occupies. Okay, and I think that's probably close enough because I'm going to do some slight cleanups too. So once you see in the preview that it's getting you at least close, because remember, he's going to be overlaid back on there. So you don't have to be, or your subject is going to be overlaid back on there. Now, unless you plan to move that subject, it will cover some of the not so perfect stuff. Once you get this set, just click OK. And now we have a new layer, and you can see where he was outlined. So this is the clean background plate. Okay, and that's what I'm going to be using. And to get rid of the marching ants, you would just do a Control or Command D. Now, even though I know, sorry, I'm going to be covering this up, I would actually like to do a little bit of cleanup on this myself. So you can determine for your image what you might want to do to clean it up. Because personally, I'm not thrilled about whatever this thing is here. It might be to keep people from driving onto the street. So I'm going to try grabbing the patch tool here and come down and just draw and try to drag along parts of this curb. And again, you won't be working with this image, so you can just decide if this patch tool will help you to just do a little bit of cleanup. And I don't want to go too crazy, but and then what I would like to do, as I said, is get rid of this because I find this a bit distracting behind him. So I'm just dragging from where the issue is to a cleaner area that I want to use as the patch. And then I release and it makes the patch. Same thing here, I think, in case I want to move him. Just want to be sure some of this is a little bit cleaner. Oops, let me So again, just do whatever cleanup you need for your image. And again, because he's going to be there, I'm not going to get too precise about this. Okay, so now we have this, what I'm calling a clean background plate. So the background plate is if you get a shot without a subject on it. And if you're shooting generally, it's kind of a good idea with putting people in front of things or anything to get that plate and then shoot your subject in the scene also. And then if you need to clean something up, you've got the nice clean background that you can use for reference. Okay, so now we've got the background plate. Now what I want to do is convert this black background plate to a smart object. And the reason I want to do that is that after you add the blur effect, it's going to change the image. So if you've converted to a smart object first, it will give you the opportunity to go back in, see the settings you used, and modify them if you want to. So it gives you some more flexibility to have that clean background plate converted to a smart object. Okay, so on that same layer, I'm going to, and just away from the text, right click in there so we get this menu and come down to where it says convert to smart object and left click on that. And now you can see it's put this little icon in the lower right hand corner. These do not have them. So that's what tells you that this is now a smart object. So now it's prepared so you can work with it. Now I'm going to do something that I'm saying you do not need to do because I am going to show you 3 different approaches to a blurred background. So I'm going to duplicate this layer 3 times just so I can show you those different approaches. For you, you would pick the one approach that you want to use and you'd only have to work with that one layer. Okay, so you don't need to be duplicating it 3 times like I am. So let's do 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we have, this one is going to become a, let me get this out of the way so you can see, a smooth Gaussian blur in my demo. This one is going to become a motion blur. And then this one is going to be radial blurs. Okay, so I'm going to show you 3 different approaches, and you would pick one of the 3 to work with yourself. Now, if you want to do it 3 times like this and then see which one you like best for yours, that's cool too. But I just want to let you know you do not have to duplicate it 3 times like that just for the process. Okay, so now let me turn off these. And I'm going to work until I'm activating the smooth Gaussian blur layer for me. So be sure the layer you want to work with is active and has your blue highlight on it. Okay, so the first blur effect I do want to work with is using a Gaussian blur. And as I said, this should give you a smooth all over blur. To work with Gaussian blur, we come to the top of the interface to where it says filter up here where my highlighter is on the top. Filter, click on that. Come down to where it says blur, and then we go to the flyout and come down to where it says Gaussian blur and get that highlighted and left click on that. And now we get this pop-up box for Gaussian blur. Okay, and as you can see, it's made, this picture already had some blur in it, but it's made it even blurrier. And so what you can do is, first of all, I like to turn on the checkbox for preview to see, and then with these little magnifying glasses, I like to click it so I can see a little bit more about what's going on in there too and get a sense of what's going on. Okay, so now for the Gaussian blur, it's a relatively simple kind of an adjustment. You get to choose the radius for the number of pixels that you want the radius to be, and the higher you go, the blurrier it'll be. The further to the left you go, the less blurry it will be. So I cannot give you an exact number to use for this. It's just trial and error, and do it to taste for your image. So I'm just pulling a little at a time, and then I am seeing what the result is. Let's see here. Oh, and by the way, if this is highlighted and you're active in that box, if it keeps jumping too far for you, you can just use your down or up arrows to adjust the numbers. And I'm just watching to see how this goes, and when it gets to something that looks, you know, because for this one I don't want it super blurry behind him. I just want the sense of there's a blurred background, so the focus is on him. And so I'm going to stick with 17 for this, and I'm going to click OK. So once you get the amount of blur to the level that you want, just left click OK in that Gaussian blur pop-up box and accept it. So a couple things to look at here. So one is, on this layer that we were just working on, you can see now, because we had that smart object on there, it has added sub-layers, and there's one here called Gaussian blur. So let me turn on my guy and be sure your subject or your object is up on the top of the stack so that it's not hidden, and turn on the eye. So now I can, and because he's on his own layer, he will not get affected by anything I'm doing down here because he's way up on his own layer. So now I can say, okay, is this amount of blur good or bad, or enough, not enough? And let's just say that I want to make it a little less blur. So then what you do is you'd come down to where it says Gaussian blur, and right next to that, on that, you double left click, and again, I'm going to click on this so I can see where I am here, see how blurry it is. And let's say, all right, you know, maybe I was a little more aggressive than I wanted to be on that, and I did 17. Let me just maybe make it 15 and see what happens. So then after you make your adjustment, click OK, and it makes it at whatever the 15 amount is, or whatever amount you could go a lot more aggressively if you want, but that would be the way to do it, is double click on where it says Gaussian blur, and it'll pop up your adjustments box again, and once you get it the way you like, just click OK, and then it makes the adjustment on that layer. Now, to me, again, you have to think logically when you're doing these things too. I mean, so you didn't capture it in camera, and you're maybe fudging it a little bit here in Photoshop, but you still want it to look realistic when people look at it. And in real life, if there's a blurred background like that, it's not going to be all that blurred on the same plane as him. So probably this road and this side of this curb is still going to be in focus. So you sort of have to think of the logic of what would really be happening. So let's try to mask out those areas of the image that got blurred that logically shouldn't be blurred. So we're still on that Gaussian blur layer is active, and we'll come down to the bottom of the layers panel to the mask icon, which is right there, the square, the rectangle with the circle in it. And we've added a new layer mask. Now, if you're not familiar with masks in Photoshop, white is going to show or reveal everything on the layer. So everything we've done so far is showing because we've got a white mask. Anything you want to hide on that layer, you'd have to paint out or cover with black. Black will hide, white will show. So if we want to hide the road and part of that curb, we need to put some black where that area is onto this white mask. So first of all, you never want to paint on your actual thumbnail image. So be sure that the frame, white frame, is around the mask. So that's active, and it is. Come to your toolbar, come down to the brush tool and left click on that. I've got black as my foreground color, which is what I want. And I'm just going to start painting. And you see the black circle around my magenta highlighter thing? That's the brush size. So, and now it's white. So I am painting away, and watch, if you watch, you'll see it'll get less blurry where I am painting. You're watching the image. And again, I can paint right over him because he's up on his own layer. He's not being affected by this. I'm down on the background plate layer. And I might leave that a little blurry there because it's getting further away from him. But certainly the parts right here around him, I want to be in focus. All right, so now we've gone from that to that. Okay, so you can see the blur that's been added. So that is the Gaussian blur approach to making an overall blurred background. So now let me turn that off. I don't have to, I'm going up to another layer, but it's just easier to do that. And now we're going to try a different kind of blur, and we're going to work with motion blur, which honestly, since he is in motion, this is the most logical blur to use for this kind of an image, but you can do whatever you want to be creative. Okay, so now if we're going to work with motion blur, first things first, we need to be sure that layer is active. So left click on that layer and be sure your layer that you're going to work with is active. We already have the smart object on, so if you don't have the smart object on your layer, then do that right click in here and then come down on the layer and then come down and convert it to smart object. Okay, so now we're going to go to a different place and a different filter. So we're going to again go to the top of the interface to filter, left click on that, come down to blur, and then we're going to go across to the flyout and come down to where it says motion blur. So filter, blur, motion blur, and left click. Okay, so now it's a different kind of blur. Yes, you can see it obviously blurred, but it's a different kind of blur than what we just had a moment ago. So again, you know you're in the motion blur because this pop-up box says motion blur. Again, have the preview clicked to on. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller so I can see what's happening. Now, for my image, this actually is on a pretty good angle it came up with here. So given the angle that he is moving, I want to, for my image, match the angle that he is moving. So if you're trying to add motion to something, you probably want to try to match the angle that they are on. And I think that 6 looked pretty good, so I'm going to stick with it. You have two ways to do it. You can either enter a number into the angle of degrees here, or you can work with this little line inside the circle and just click on that and rotate it to the angle that you like. Okay, and again, you can use the up or down arrows if it's not going in enough of an incremental hop for you. So once you get the angle of blur the way that you want it, then you have to adjust the distance. Okay, so this is, again, how little or how much blur there's going to be. Okay, so you can see to the left is less motion blur, to the right is more motion blur. And I don't want this to be too crazy, but you know, if you're doing something like sci-fi or something, you may want to, let me see where that is. You may want to go a little bit more extreme. I actually don't mind that. All right, let me leave it there. I think that's probably good enough. So once you get the angle of blur, either putting a number here in trial and error or just playing with that little line inside that circle, and then the distance, in other words, the amount of blur, then click OK in that box to accept it. And just like what we saw with the Gaussian blur, you'll get these other sub layers, and same thing here. You can double click next to where it says motion blur. If you say, you know, I would have liked a little more blur or a little less blur, you know, so, but I'd like to make it look like he's really whipping along, so I'm going to leave it. But you can adjust yours if you like. And again, once you make the adjustment, click OK, and then we've got the motion blur. All right, so that's the different type of blur. So we've so far done the Gaussian and the motion blur. So let me turn that off, and now we're going to move up and work with radial blurs. So again, always be sure that you have that layer highlighted that you're working with so it's active, and that you've converted to a smart object so you have that flexibility to go back and make adjustments if you need to. So now with the radial blur, what I want to do is try both the spin and the zoom effects that are in there. So again, up to the top of the interface to filter menu, come down to blur, and come down to where it says radial blur, and left click once that's highlighted. And again, we get a little pop-out box. And there's a variety of settings here, and this looks a little bit different than what we had before. So again, you can do trial and error as to how much blur you want it to have. and also the types of blur and the quality. I think for the video, maybe I'll just stick with good so that it doesn't take too long processing, but you could put it on best if you want to. The blur method, I'm going to show you each of these. So let's start with spin just because it's the one on top and that it is already set there. So again, my amount of blur, let me just try this and see. Let me stop there. And then the other thing you can adjust before you hit OK is, see this blur center designation here? You can move this around, and since he's not in the center, and this, you can see what it's going to do. Look at this. You can see it's simulating the amount of spin that it's going to put behind your subject or your object. So because he's a little off center, even though I can't see it exactly, I'm just going to drag this down closer to where he is so that he hopefully becomes the center of the blur. Okay, so I've got my amount of blur set. I've got my spin as my method I want to try for the blur, and I didn't change it, but you can certainly adjust the quality to whatever you want. And then I moved my blur center to be hopefully behind my subject. And then once you've done those things, click OK. And wait for Photoshop to do its thing, and look at this. So I'm telling you, so this could be a really cool special effect, like if you want to show something coming out of this vortex or whatever else. Now, you can also, if that spin was too aggressive, not only can you go back and maybe lessen it a little bit here. So I'll make that maybe 20 instead of 23, and then click OK to accept it and let it try again. But then you can also come to the top of the layers panel to where it says opacity, and you can lower the opacity a little bit, you know, again, depending on your image. Now for me, I don't care for this effect, but you might want to have it looking like some creature is coming out of some blurred tunnel or something, depending on what you're doing, you know, or it's falling away, or, you know, like whatever, if you're making a composite or something and Alice is falling down the rabbit hole or something, you know. So that's why I'm showing you these special effects too. Okay, so that is the spin effect. Now let me go back in there again, because I also want to show you the zoom effect. So here the blur method was spin. Now we're going to click on zoom to get the zoom. And you can see, again, it's simulating what it is doing here. And I think the center is still pretty much where I want it to be behind him. And again, it could be like somebody being sucked into another world, or, you know, or going through a portal, or, you know, something. But the other effect it can simulate is if you're using a telephoto zoom lens and you were moving the lens as you were shooting the picture with a slow shutter speed, this can simulate that kind of effect. So again, because I want it to look more like those angled zoom lines are going in, I'm going to increase this from where it is now. And let me try roughly doubling it and see what happens with that. Okay, so I've got my zoom effect. I'm leaving it on good. Typically I'd use best for myself, and I can see, you know, where things are. So let's click OK and see what happens. Yeah, see, so you can see now all these angled lines coming in behind him, like, again, he's going to be pulled into this portal and into another room, into another galaxy or something. So anyway, so that subject is on its own layer, and so it's not at all affected by any of these special effects. So we have before and after that. For the radial blur, we have before and after for the Gaussian blur, which was that smooth overall. And then we have before and after for the motion blur. And as I said, I think for him, and him being on a skateboard, you know, it's really the best thing to have a motion kind of a blur effect. Now, if you want to see something totally optional and a little bit trickier that you might want to try or think about, especially with something like a motion blur, is you could think about your subject in motion duplicating it. So I'm going to be on his layer. His layer is active. Drag it down to the bottom of the layers panel to that add new layer icon, which is the square with the plus. So now we've got a copy. So this is the rear skateboarder. So if I want to make it look like he's going so fast that he's almost like got G-forces going on him or something, that's what I want to move him behind the original guy. So I am going to drag him below the original guy, okay? And so let me turn it off. So we're only working with him. And now with that rear skateboarder, because he's going to be behind the other one, and because this one is at the top of the stack, he will fall in front of this one. So we want the blur coming from behind that one. So with this guy active in the toolbar, go to the move tool, which is that cross right there. And we get this box that's pink box with handles around him so we can move him. So let me just left click inside that box and slightly move him back. And what I'm looking at as a reference in this image is I'm keeping him lined up with the shadow on the ground so that I know he's staying pretty much where he should be. And let me get away from the move tool. And now let me turn on the top guy. Okay, so here we can see we've got our original skateboarder that we did. This is the one we've duplicated and he's behind the other guy. So now let me, with this turned off, just so we see what we're doing here, convert him to a smart object. So the rear skateboarder, the one that's going to look like he's zooming behind, to a smart object. Right click on that layer, come down where it says convert to smart object. We got that little icon. We're going to go up to filter, blur, motion blur. And again, want to mimic the 6-degree angle because that's what the other one was on. And I don't think we need to be quite that fast, but we want to make it look like he's sort of a turbo skateboarder or something here. So let's see. Well, let me just leave it there because, again, you'll have to do it to your own taste for your own image if you want to try something like this, but it's just to show you how to achieve the effect if you want to. So I'll click OK. And now we've added motion blur to the rear skateboarder. Let's turn on. And so now you can see that I'm going to move him forward just a touch because I want him looking like the guy is going so fast that it's just blurring out the back. Okay, so now we've gone from our original image and with all the distractions and everything else in there to this blurred motion image, as well as a couple other approaches that we can do by using different types of blur, Gaussian, motion, and radial blurs. And then, of course, once you've done something like this, then you can also then finish it to taste here. So this is a little on the dark side. So for my image personally, I'm going to add a stamp layer. So come to the bottom of the layers panel, I'll click on this add new layer to add an empty layer, and then I'll do what they call the claw move maneuver here. So I'm going to simultaneously press Shift, Control or Command, Alt or Option and E, and that creates this stamp layer. And I will label that so you know what it is I'm calling it. And essentially it's basically a composite of what you've done so far but without collapsing things. And to maybe just brighten him up a little bit, let's come to the bottom of the layers panel, add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer. There we go, there's the new layer. And for bright in your properties panel for that layer, and again, your properties might be at the top. I'm going to add just a little bit of brightness to this to perk it up. Yeah, that's good. Because again, you have to, think logically. The light is coming from behind him. So you can't brighten up this side of him too much because logically this side of him would be in shade. And then he might be a little contrasty and the whole thing might be a little contrasty for the whole idea of motion. So for the contrast component in the properties panel, I'm actually going to reduce this just a little bit. Yeah, just make it a touch softer. Yeah, I think that's better because he's moving. So that is the end of this first video, and it was focused on using an overall background blur to a subject with an optional extra about how to do a little bit of finishing using some of these kinds of blurs. So as I said, I will do 2 other videos in this set on special effects using blur, and they'll be on my channel as separate videos too. So anyway, I hope you have fun experimenting and seeing what you can achieve by adding blur to your images in Photoshop.